Welcome to Episode 3 of the Trilogy of Jessica Bauer. In this intense chapter, Jessica reflects on her traumatic past and navigates her uncertain present. Watch as she recalls her first encounter with Stan, grapples with her current situation under Theodore Waters, and struggles to maintain her sense of self. Don't miss out on this gripping story of survival and resilience. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for updates on upcoming chapters. Jessica shivered as she was led back to the general's quarters. Theodore Waters wasn't as brutally petty as Rex, but he was capable of much worse. She suspected the scar on her thigh would be nothing compared to what awaited her. The door to the general's headquarters had barely opened when a voice made Jessie turn around. "Jenny, is that you?" Her eyes widened, recognizing the young man in the reserve uniform. Her face drained of blood. She only knew Rex's customers. "Stan? Fancy meeting you here." The soldiers escorting her were taken aback. They didn't step away, but they didn't push her in either. The young man looked stricken as he eyed carefully the men around him. He had heard about the special order issued by Theodore Waters. But at this point, most of his orders didn't make sense. He hadn't known who the girl was, but now he realized he knew her far better than most. His hand found her arm, and she flinched. "What do you think you're doing?" "I'm sorry for what happened." "Sorry? Sorry?" Her voice rose as she repeated the rhetorical question, but then dropped as she continued. "Do you know how much I had to pay for it?" Her hands fisted, and she moved towards him, but one of her guards stepped in. "Miss, General Waters has given us strict orders." Stan's face fell. "You're with him?" His voice sounded both boyish and hurt when he asked. Jessie laughed, but her eyes were still full of anger. "What? Do you think I'm going out on a date with him? You made sure I would never be able to make my own choices again." The guard took her arm and dragged her inside. She heard Stan's plea. "I'm so sorry, Jenny. I didn't mean to." "Fuck you!" she muttered under her breath. She was rushed through the endless corridors. Even if she wanted, she wouldn't be able to find her way herself. She was unceremoniously thrust inside. "Is there any way this can stay between us?" The superior looked at her with raised eyebrows. She breathed. "Didn't think so." Her shoulders slumped and turned towards the fireplaces. The flames were hypnotizing her, and she hardly heard the door lock behind her. She sat on the sofa, and with her chin on her knees, she let her thoughts drift back to the past. Of all her customers, young and old, Stan had left his imprint in her, quite literally. Her right hand massaged her neck and slipped beneath her shirt to trace the outline of the scars. They went down to the small of her back. The wounds had been deep and hadn't healed well, leaving protuberant scars that went as far as the beginning of her buttocks. Her face was hard as she examined the events that had led to the whipping that had made her forsake any remnant of hopes of ever being free. It was difficult to remember her age, as time had scrambled after her entry into Rex's house. She must have been 15 or 16, maybe older? She had been quite young, but starting to get used to her new station in life. She closed her eyes to picture the first time she had seen Stan. A young reserve soldier had been ushered in her bedroom. He was looking at his feet, and she could have sworn he was blushing. "Hello, soldier. Can I help you with something?" He had mumbled, and she had let out a giggle. Missy and Abigail had chastised her later about letting her guards down. Customers were buying pleasure from her. They were not here to find love. Jessie had nodded, but her eyes were sparkling. What a fool she had been, and how aptly she had learned her lesson. She jumped out of her seat in frustration. In a few steps, she was standing over the bar and pouring herself a glass. Someone had replenished the drinks and added fresh glasses. It must be nice to have everything done for you. She could get used to this. The locked door didn't bother her that much. After all, she was used to this. It was safe, and she knew exactly how to act. Now, if only Theodore Waters had been a normal man. But then again, If had he been like her other customers, she would be long gone by now. The drink distracted her from her memories of Stan and the aftermath of their time together. Her present wasn't a nice, happy distraction either. Her eyes kept on going to the massive door, but Waters wasn't showing his face. She wasn't his girlfriend or anyone for that matter, just a missing item. She could have been his pet that had wandered off. Whatever he thought of her, she wanted her punishment to be over. Maybe this time he will kill her. She wasn't afraid of dying, nor of rape or even torture, but losing what was left of her integrity made her shudder. She couldn't quite articulate it, but she knew Theodore Waters could see right through her and uncover her hidden secrets. And she would lose herself. It would be worse than dying. She yawned. Her legs were feeling heavy, and thoughts were grating the inside of her head. Jessie kicked off her boots and curled herself on the couch. She wasn't going to sleep. Her predicament was too dangerous to really relax, but closing her eyes felt good. When Theo walked in, he noticed the stillness in the room. His efforts to capture Thomas had been in vain, but his right-hand man Fitz was working on it. When one of his men informed him they had found her, for a split second, he confused Thomas with the girl. Why was he pointlessly hunting people who didn't give a damn about him? He didn't care for this girl, but that didn't give her the right to do the same. He had bought her from Rex, offered her a new life, and she had shown her gratitude by running for the hills. His blood was boiling. He was already on tenterhooks because of the Bauer family, and what had been his distraction turned to be equally difficult. He couldn't see her anywhere. He opened his mouth to call the guards, but he stumbled on a pair of boots. He spied her golden, silky hair spilling from the sofa. He stalked to the fireside and found her asleep. She was huddled against the sofa's back, with her back towards the fire. Her left leg was bent, but the other one was dangling out of the sofa, and her hands were pillowing her head. He wanted to shake her awake and pour out his fury for her insolent display. But that anger was drifting away with each breath that made her chest rise and fall. He noticed the blood-stained knife on the floor. In a swift movement, he took hold of it and locked it up in his desk. He had been told about the man she had stabbed and about Stan Fitz's outburst. The latter had already been a pain in the neck for insubordination and rumors of treachery. Maybe it was time he dealt with him. He glanced at the girl. Her face looked so young and innocent, she looked out of place in this carnival. He shook his head slightly to gather his thoughts and went to pour himself a drink. He settled on the armchair, and his gaze wandered back to the body sprawled in front of him. Sure, her relaxed face made her look youthful, but her body told another story. His eyes took in every curve displayed before him, lingering at her hips and small wrists. He had executed people for less. She kept on crossing the line. As he took another sip of his drink, he wondered what kept him from getting rid of her. There were plenty women around, more skilled, sexier, or smarter. He could easily replace her, and in fact, he could go on without a woman gracing his bed. Her voice, her eyes, and that insufferable insolence were irritating him, amusing him. Yet, somehow, it made him respect her guts. Even when he could see fear in her eyes, her demeanor remained stubborn. A door banged in the distance. She sighed, moved to her back, and stretched her arms over her head. Waters' throat went dry. She turned her head, and her sleepy gaze caught his sharp look. She sat up, brought her legs closer, and wrapped her arms around them. "Hi." In an instant, his face was stern and scrubbed from any trace of desire or tenderness. "Did you have fun?" His tone didn't stop her from smirking. "Actually, yes." "Do you know how many men and how much time I wasted?" he demanded. "Don't really care," she snorted. "You should really watch your mouth." His voice was soft, but edged with danger. She shrugged, but Waters could see the apprehension in her eyes. Rex really did a number on his girls, and maybe he did it too. He had made sure that both men and women flinched with his very gestures. He could feel the temper rising at her effrontery, but he was exhausted by his long day. Watching her sleep had made him relax, the same way some people find peace in watching a cat sleep. He stood up and carefully set his glass on its usual place and pinched the bridge of his nose. He heard the servants preparing the dining room. It was a familiar sound for him, but he knew that this time they would be setting up a place for her. He dragged a hand through his curly mop of hair in frustration and took a deep breath. "Care for dinner? I'm having mine in an hour. Feel free to join me." His words were casual, but he was observing her face closely. Her eyes didn't shy away, and her face remained composed. He nodded and walked to the door. Her voice interrupted him. "What am I doing here? Didn't Rex send someone?" "Do you want to go back there?" He had turned around to face her. Arms crossed against his chest, he seemed genuinely curious. "No, but—" "Not buts. I don't have the time for this." His tone changed. "See you in an hour." He flashed her a brilliant smile, confusing her further. "Oh, and the door will be locked. No shenanigans," he added. He ignored her as he walked out of the door. She huffed in frustration and stretched again. She was wide awake now. She padded to the bathroom and washed her face. She looked haggard in the mirror, and her eye makeup was smudged. Good riddance. She hated it anyways. Applying makeup was part of a routine that she no longer needed. She paused and stared into her own gaze. She didn't have to go back. Rex. No more beatings, disgusting men, and quiet desperation. Yet it was nothing like the freedom she had tasted in the street of Columbus. She was still under someone's thumb. Given that for now, Theodore Waters had treated her like a human being, there was no guarantee it would continue. Jessie sighed and remembered something her dad used to say: "Beggars can't be choosers." She looked at the bathtub. Baths were also part of the routine of a woman of pleasure. It wouldn't do if their skins were anything but lustrous and soft. She heard voices from the dining room and shrugged. Didn't Waters act like she belonged here? She was drinking his liquor, sleeping in his bed, and eating his food. A bath wouldn't be too much, would it? She knocked at the dining room, and the servant lady peered out. "Hi, I was wondering if there was any way to have some warm water for a bath. I'm sorry, but I didn't know who to ask," she added quickly. The woman looked at her with something like pity and smiled. "Of course, I'll arrange it." Jessie sat on a chair by the sink. She could hear the woman speaking to someone else. A door opened and someone left, but she could hear cutlery being set and two women speaking. "Poor girl, I wonder what the general wants with her." "What else?" laughed the other woman. "I just don't see why. It's widely known that both Timothy and Samantha Bauer have been reunited behind bars, and that Thomas is hot on their tails." "You don't say?" "Seriously, Todd has seen them, and I think there's also a son. I'm just saying that the general already has enough on his plate without—" Jessie stopped listening and leaned her head against the cool tiles. Her family. Her family, along with her long-dead mother, were alive and just within reach. The whole room swayed, but she stood up abruptly. But the door opened, and a woman followed by two men brought huge buckets of warm water. Before leaving the bathroom, the servant handed Jessie a small bottle with some kind of oil. "It's lavender. They say it's soothing." Jessie muttered a few words of thanks. She was grateful for this small act of kindness, but she was finding it hard to struggle against her own demons. She barely waited for them to leave before she started to strip off. The warm water was soothing her tense muscles, but her mind was reeling. She stretched her feet out of the water and ducked her head under the water. It felt so warm and safe, but she eventually had to come out for air. As she methodically washed her hair, She focused on the task at hand. She may have been surrounded by luxury, but she didn't have the luxury of feeling. She knew very well if she started to cry, she wouldn't be able to stop. And then what would she do? Her senses and wits were her only weapons for survival. Dried-eyed, Jessie Bauer immersed herself into the warm water to escape the memory of the faces of those she called Mom and Dad. Waters walked through the corridor with a gaze that made everyone back off. Samantha was at the root of his tempestuous mood. His fury at Samantha was almost making him stagger. He had to admire her desire to survive, but she was becoming more difficult as time went by. Even with the presence of Timothy, she wasn't budging. Well, maybe he should open his eyes and tell him about his dear brother Thomas's infatuation with his wife. He stopped at this thought. He was right in front of his door. His hand was curled around the handle. Even now, after all the bad blood, he couldn't betray Thomas like this. He hated his weakness, but Thomas was his brother. He'd rather shoot him down than betray his confidence. He swallowed back this idea and walked in his room. The girl was standing by the window. Her face was pale and avoided his gaze. He nodded at her, but she pretended not to notice. He was pouring a drink when she spoke. "So, what do you expect me to do?" He kept his attention on his drink. Truth was, he really needed one. "What am I, your pet? Mistress?" She looked angrier than before, puzzling him further. Hadn't he been kind enough? He hadn't even made her pay for her little stunt. "Are you planning to give me a headache?" He grunted. "Are you planning to answer my questions with other questions?" Strangely, her cheekiness reminded him of the other blonde he had to deal with today. He appraised her, and this time she was looking back at him. A glint in her eyes, and the way she was twisting her hands as she spoke, made him bite back a laugh. No, there wasn't anything remotely similar between the psychotic Samantha Bauer and this urchin. The first one was a pain in the ass, and the latter was an intoxicating breath of fresh air. The door opened, and Jessie recognized the voice of the housekeeper. "Dinner is ready, General." He beckoned her towards the dining room. She shrugged and followed him. He hardly used it now that Thomas was gone, and he had no actual friend. As they walked to the dining room adjoining the bedroom, he noticed that she was wearing one of his old shirts. Earlier, he had been too distracted by her body to even notice what was covering it. Now he couldn't help but notice how comfortable and at ease she looked in jeans and shirt. As if dresses were the costume, and this was the real her, whoever she was. "You raided my wardrobe?" "What? Was I supposed to do the walk of shame in my dress?" She wrinkled her nose. "I hate this dress." Gallantly, he held the chair for her as if he had done this thousands of times to thousands of women. She awkwardly plopped on it. As he sat in front of her, he didn't let her even look at the food before he began scrutinizing her. "My men tell me you know Stan Fitz." Jessie sighed. "Can I at least have some food before I tackle this one?" Her stomach growled in approval, and Waters couldn't contain his mirth. It was a small laugh, but it was a surprising sound to even himself. He was in the middle of the most sticky and stinky Bauer situation ever, and yet, right now, he didn't give a damn. He gestured towards the food, and she filled her plate with some mashed potatoes and meat. She leisurely took bite after bite, watching him coyly. She had no desire of talking about Stan. His betrayal felt still raw, although it had happened years ago. He had been the last drop that made her drown completely in the murky waters of Rex's world. She was also enjoying her fare. In her former situation, food was seldom served warm, and nobody really sat around dinner tables. It was eaten in corners, and fast enough to avoid any problems or delay with their job. The food in front of her smelled so good and tasted even better. She wouldn't trade her former life for this, although, and she cautiously considered the man in front of her. The ground was far shakier. He was looking at her expectantly. He had this way of regarding her with such a calm and controlled air that she could imagine him bursting up without any notice and turn the table upside down. It made her balance her fork against her plate and wipe her hands. "He came to Rex's. Many of your men do." He nodded, but his brilliant blue eyes had darkened. Jessie noticed that most of the food on his plate had been left untouched. "I don't see many of them chasing you around." She nodded. He was good at fencing with words. Her body quaked slightly, remembering Rex's whip breaking the soft skin on her back. It was the early days when she still believed and hoped that one day her father would find her, or that she would break free. After the punishment, she hadn't dared to even think about the possibility of freedom. All this, thanks to silly Stan. She had thought she loved him, but the price she had paid had been bitter enough. She didn't owe him anything. A smirk twisted her lips as she replied, "He lost his virginity with little old me." Waters choked on his drink and coughed a few times. She couldn't tell whether he was laughing or angry. He recovered quickly, but his voice didn't sound as playful anymore when he asked, "That good?" Unsure about how to answer this, Jessie chose instead to help herself to some bread. A Rex girl never traded secrets about customers, except to Rex himself. It was a matter of survival. Most of the men who came around were dangerous and had no qualms about killing a woman. Between the girls, there had been less restraint as they often shared the same men. Jessie didn't know how to pursue the matter without talking about what Stan had actually done. It felt childish now, and oh, so ridiculous. They had planned to elope. She had found a way of getting out of the gates and had even wandered beyond the poppy fields, but Stan never came. And Rex had plenty of time to realize she was missing. She never received any actual explanation until a few years later when Alma passed her his note. He hadn't been able to make it because of some order his father had given him. He didn't ask how she was, and if there had been any consequences of her attempt. Nothing. Only a few lines about how well he was serving the elective and that he missed her. Jessie had torn the note into little bits. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear Waters talking to her. She shook her head in confusion, and he repeated his question. "How old were you when Rex found you?" His tone was crisp and formal. 17. She replied right away. She was so relieved he wasn't asking more about Stan. "But they trained me first, but I lost track. I'm not sure how old I am. More than 20, I guess." She added casually, as if she was talking about a concert she had seen and couldn't remember when. "Rex is a sleazy bastard." Despite him, he was appalled, but she was smirking. "Look who's speaking." "Come on, I'm not Rex." He shrugged. "You've got a pretty long list of victims." "It's unavoidable when you're handling a whole democracy. Can't be naive about this." She huffed, but instead of retorting, she took a spoonful of vegetables. Chewing slowly, she eyed him warily as he did the same. "Why won't you call me by my name?" "Well, if you would just tell me your name." "I told you." Her serious and adamant way of speaking made him snicker. "Really? Do you think I'm that stupid?" She barely raised her eyebrows, but he went on. "I get it. I might even agree that it's none of my business, but I'm sure as hell not going to call you Jenny or Jennifer." She didn't show any reaction, but a smile was playing on her lips. There wasn't any clear link between her and Jessica Bauer. She had been careful. Even her friends in the midst of Rex's girls didn't know anything about her former life. But he seemed to be on top of everything, as if the world was in his palm, and he only had to think about something to make it happen. Maybe he had seen her as a child, but was it enough to recognize her? Waters noticed a flicker of panic in her face, but he couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from. It was probably just confirming that she was hiding her name, and that maybe she had some grudge against someone, possibly himself. He had killed plenty of fathers, mothers, brothers and sisters to have a long line of people wanting to avenge them. Since that night, Thomas had stood in his bedroom. He had learned that anyone could be capable of betrayal. He abruptly stood up. "I have a new guest to see." Jessie's heart leaped in her chest, but she nodded nonchalantly. "So am I supposed to wait for you in all my finery?" "Do whatever the fuck you want," he retorted sharply. He left in a flutter of air, leaving her confused and dizzy. Nevertheless, she polished off her plate. No matter how worried she was, her survival instincts weren't failing her. She needed all her strength for whatever was awaiting her. The woman came to take the food away, changed her plate, and rolled in the dessert. It was a luscious pumpkin pie with a side of cream. It reminded her of Maisie. She had barely known her, but there had been something between her and her father. She would bring pie for them. It awoke memories of others she had known. Her dear Adrian. She should be fighting for him instead of sleeping with the man bent on destroying them. She shouldn't be enjoying his company, nor eating his food. She took a forkful of pie and shoved it into her mouth. It wasn't like she had any choice on the matter. And besides, she argued with herself, it wasn't like her family had looked for her. It was probably an irrational complaint, but she couldn't get it out of her head. Once she was done, the housekeeper came back to clean up the table. Jessie looked at her carefully. The woman looked kind, but men of power, Jessie had learned this the hard way, knew how to have loyal help. Whatever she said would be repeated to Waters, and maybe this time he would really snap. She was still waiting for his punishment for her day of freedom. It wouldn't be wise to push it by asking too many questions. He hadn't even addressed it yet. Experience had taught her that the longer it took, the stronger was the blow. "Would you like some coffee, miss?" "Nah, it's fine, thanks." Jessica blushed as the woman took her plate and glass. She felt out of place. The woman looked at her gently. "Are you all right? Would you require a change of clothes?" Jessica opened her mouth in surprise, but hesitated before answering. "Would it be okay? I do need some clean clothes and underclothes. My bra is strapless and not the most comfortable." A hint of pink graced the woman's cheeks, but she nodded. Jessica remembered she wasn't among women who were comfortable talking about sex and private things. She had gotten used to Rex's girl's casual way of life. "Anything specific?" "Well, I wouldn't mind jeans and a shirt, no dress." To hell with awkwardness, Jessie unbuttoned her shirt halfway down and reached inside to untie her bra. "Here, that's my size." The woman nodded. "I will go find something." She sounded flustered, but Jessie really felt a genuine laughter bubbling inside of her. Abigail, her roommate, would have loved this story, but she would probably never see her again. Her heart pinched. For years, Rex's house had been her home, and the girls her only family. And here she was catapulted between a mesmerizing madman and the family she had given up on. If he only knew, and if only she could truly care for them. A normal person would at least try. Jessie shrugged off this feeling and walked back to the bedroom. The fire had been kindled. Jessie felt boredom choke her. She knew better than rummaging through his things. She was already skating on thin ice. She slid off her jeans to get more comfortable and paced in front of the fire. The shirt was long enough to cover her underwear. As if on cue, she heard a knock on the door and the key turned. Waters wouldn't knock. Jessie faced the door, her eyes darting around the room to find something to use in case of attack. A soldier came in and dropped a box at her feet. She hardly had the time to see what it was before the door was locked once more. She kneeled in front of the cardboard box and instantly recognized the leather jacket spilling out. It was the jacket she had been wearing when she was kidnapped. She wasn't sad about leaving Rex's mansion. She lost everything there and gained only scars. But all in spite of this horrible ordeal, she had built a family of some sort. The girls were always there for her, in spite of their own miserable existence. They taught her how to separate her mind from her body, how to handle violent men, how to survive in this hell, and she had lost them. She didn't want to go back. The thought of Rex and all those men made her stomach revolt. Her hands stilled inside the box as they reached a row of tattered books. Some clients were kinder than others. A few needed to give her presents to make themselves feel less needy. It didn't matter how she came to those books, but they gave her a haven from which garnered strength to keep on going. Now that she was stepping away from her nightmarish life, it was more difficult to escape the disgust and sadness. She had rubbed her eyes over and over again, but the tears were still trickling through her eyelashes. She wasn't free yet, and would probably never be. This was who she was, what she had been chiseled into. The thought made her heave, but she didn't let herself sob. Containing tears was more difficult because there was no distraction from her feelings. The door creaked open, and she straightened up. She wiped her eyes with a corner of her blanket and plastered a smile on her face.
Jessica's journey is far from over. Stay tuned as we uncover more about her past and her fight for survival. Remember to leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe and share with your friends.